Here's my contact information. I'm going to go through kind of a quick overview of the sunflower market outlook, talk about some of the, I guess, changes we're seeing and a little bit of the dynamics now in the last several months. If you have some questions later on that you think of or want to talk about things in more detail, here's my email address as well as my work cell phone number, so feel free to reach out. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, let me get this so that it works. There we go. So just a quick recap. We have both the production or the supply side as well as the demand side. So we'll start with the supply side. I do want to break down sunflower production or planted acreage by state. Just to remind everybody that North Dakota and South Dakota are really the core dominant areas for sunflower production for both oil varieties as well as the confection or non-oil varieties. But there's quite a range of other states that do produce some acreage. As you can see on this graphic, the acres for 2021 were not at necessarily record lows, but they were significantly down from what we had the previous year, but similar to what we had in 2018 and 2019. Obviously, the big question this year, a big issue was production. I mean, how many pounds of total production do we have? And I did want to break down the blue line on top is total sunflower production in the US. This is, of course, from USDA. The red line is the oil seed varieties, and then the black line at the very bottom is the non-oil sunflowers. At least that's the classifications that USDA has been using. Just recognize, if you look at the blue line, technically that is the lowest total production of sunflower we've seen in the last 20 years. Not by a lot. 2013, we also had another really low production year, again, for a variety of reasons. This year, when you look at oil type only, it is not a record low, but it's near the record low we saw in 2013 and 14. Of course, our non-oil or the confection sunflowers are down significantly from the previous year. So I'm going to make some comments primarily on the market side, primarily on the oil seed varieties. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a second. So when we look at production by state, and again, North Dakota, we're a large producer in this region, South Dakota as well. Again, this is not a record low for North Dakota sunflower production, excuse me, looking at the blue line. But it is relatively low compared to the most recent years. Again, South Dakota had a little bit better year, but not by a large margin. So again, the two dominant producers being North Dakota and South Dakota. I do want to shift now to the demand side, because this is really we've had some production issues, obviously because of the drought, not only in North Dakota as well as South Dakota. So a lot of farmers think about the production side of things and say, well, one of the reasons we have such high prices is the production side. Well, we also have this demand side. And I do want to focus a little bit on this because there are some dynamics or changes that have occurred over the last several years that we need to be aware of. So when we look at how are sunflowers consumed, again, I'm using some of the USDA information. They're a little bit slow in updating some of this because they only do it once a year. The blue line is crushing and the black line is exports. So those are the two numbers that USDA follows very closely and has either weekly or monthly updates on the information. So when we look at total available supplies, we're looking at inventories, we're looking at how quickly are we burning through those inventories. This red line called non-oil use and seed is kind of the catch-all. So we got a pretty good handle on the crushing numbers because of the surveys and the information that USDA collects. We have actually some pretty good information also on the exports. What gets to be hard is kind of this non-oil use, primarily for, in USDA language, the feed pile, right? So that a lot of that would be not only for seed use, acres that are production has been dedicated for seed and seed production, but also for obviously human food consumption on the confectionery side, but also on the bird food market, as well as spoilage and wastage. So that red line kind of encapsulates a lot of different bundles of uses or potential uses. Now, you've noticed since about the early 2010s, we've seen a kind of a slight reduction now in the amount of sunflower going into the crushing sector. with resurgence then, or more dominance being placed on some of the bird food markets. So right, up until recently, we've had kind of this blending of two different demand areas, the crushing side of things as well as the bird food side. Well, that is now starting to change. When we look back at kind of historical price movements, sunflowers, and I don't mean this to be condescending or any kind of bad connotation, but the sunflower market is relatively small compared to both canola and, more importantly, the other oil seeds, primarily soybeans. So all of the oil seed complex does tend to move up and down together because there are substitutes, even though they're not perfect substitutes for each other from the oil seed and the meal side. They are close enough substitutes that they do have this influence going on between the markets. Now, these are national average prices by month. So this is monthly average prices. I just wanted to give you this long-term perspective on these price relationships over a long period of time. So the red is US soybean prices. Now this is whole soybeans. The black would be sunflower and the blue is canola. Typically, when we look at the specialty oil seeds, canola and sunflower, they too tend to have a much higher correlation. They're better substitutes for each other. Soybeans is a little bit unique because historically, when we crush soybeans, it's been the meal that has the greatest value. So a lot of the profit margins, a lot of the driving forces on the demand side behind soybeans and soybean production has not only been the export market for oil and meal, but also the domestic market for crushing, with meal being the primary driver. But that is starting to shift now in about the last 12 months. So you're starting to see, even now, if you look at the blue line, which is canola, and the black line, which is sunflower, they're starting to separate themselves a little bit more from the soybean complex. So the oil market, the oil side of the profit margin, the crushing margin, is becoming a larger driver. So let's look more specifically, and I pick the Cargill because I had access to the Cargill numbers. We could have easily picked the ADM and Enderlin, but they do a little more crushing of some of the specialty oils or the specialty sunflower, as well as canola, the high oleics. So I wanted to look at something more in the general market. So I picked Cargill. The black line is the spot market price for oil sunflower. The blue is the Cargill canola spot market price. And then the red line is the canola futures market in Canada. Now I did in Winnipeg, I did convert that into US dollars per hundredweight so we can scale them on the same graph. Now, notice when we look back historically, obviously a really strong relationship between what happens in the futures market and the spot canola price here in North Dakota. And I could have easily done the same thing for Velva. It's going to have very similar patterns. But you also notice that sunflowers, at times, sunflower tends to be connected very closely to what's happening in the canola market. And then there's times it seems to separate itself. And again, part of that is the influence of the birdseed market. But you'll notice beginning about a year ago into January, February of 2021, we started seeing some shifting going on. And that really is this resurgence or the increases that we're seeing now in the oil market. And it's the vegetable oil market in general. So one of the things I want to show you is normally I don't spend a lot of time talking about soybean oil, but this is a long-term price chart. This is from the futures market because it's easier to grab than the cash market. And you can see we did have a price spike in soybean oil back in that 2008 time period, which is back kind of in this time frame. And then now another resurgence or a pretty rapid run up in soy oil prices. And this increase in soy oil, primarily driven by some changes in policy, energy policy in California, has now also increased or lifted the demand base and the interest in alternative oils like canola and sunflower oil. So one of the major shifts now has been this increase in soybean oil prices, which then has also translated into canola pricing. Now, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on canola, but understand that there is this close price relationship or substitution that can go on the crushing side between canola and sunflower. On the canola side, there are two reasons, again, for this rapid price increase we've seen in canola. Again, also impacting sunflowers, spilling over into the sunflower market. Partially is this increase in demand or interest in soybean oil, but combined with a very, very small crop of canola, not only in the US, but more importantly in Canada. So as this oilseed complex, the prices in the oilseed complex start to rise, it's also putting a lot of lift into the sunflower market as well. And so suddenly the driving force today in today's pricing and what's going on in the marketplace is much more driven by crush margins and the demand for oil than it has been for birdseed, which again is a bit of a shift that we've seen in the last 12 months versus what we've seen in the previous years. When we look at old crop canola, and this is from this morning, from about an hour and a half ago, we're at near record high levels for canola. Okay, let me go back to this price chart here. We saw the highest price in canola ever on record this summer as we started getting to the drought and concerns about canola production. Again, that has spilled over into the sunflower market. So when we look at old crop pricing, there's a lot of concern about how much, what is the availability as there's gets to be more concerns about canola crush. That also then puts some additional pressure on sunflower prices to stay competitive because that is a competing oil and an alternative. I don't want to spend, this is the Canadian supply demand table for canola, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but that's the easiest place you can get information about kind of the pricing trends that are impacting the sunflower market. So if we look at the very bottom line at what the carryover stocks in canola is in Canada, again, which is a very large competitor for sunflower, those ending stocks are very, very small. So we're gonna have very, very tight supply chain because of the lower yields and the problems that we had this last summer. As we look forward, Canada has already started projecting what they think planted acreage as well as total production will be next year. So they are calling for very similar planted acreage from canola versus in 2021 versus 2022. And even if you plug in an average yield or a trend line yield, your bottom line number doesn't increase much. So what that suggests to me is that the specialty oil market, these high valued oils like sunflower and like canola, it's going to be at least through 2022 before we start building stocks and the inventories to a point where prices might soften. So I expect to see some very strong canola as well as sunflower prices throughout the 2022 growing season. As we look into the futures market, again, trying to look forward in time, this is what the canola futures market is looking right now, which again has an influence on how many sunflower acres are needed. So when we look at I'm going to skip over this. So as we move forward now, for the sake of time, as we move forward, I know I spent a lot of time kind of on this canola side, but that is the competing oil seed. The demand base for vegetable oils is very, very strong right now. It's really the crushing demand that's driving prices. And in today's world, the human food market as well as the bird food market is trying to keep pace with what's happening in the crush market. So as you're looking forward, trying to make some planning decisions as well as some marketing decisions, I would suggest that you look to the canola futures market as a proxy, as just a general indicator for some of the trends that we might see coming in the sunflower market as well.